Welcome to the Canny Conversations podcast, conversations with a cause with social entrepreneur SAFARAZ Ali. In this special episode, Saf and Adrian talk to the acclaimed war reporter Lynne O'Donnell. She talks about her experiences working in some of the world's biggest trouble spots, including Afghanistan and Iraq. So let's join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another Canny Conversation with a cause. Saf, we're privileged today, aren't we?
Absolutely.
We've got a very special guest with us today, and this is a slightly different conversation to the ones that we normally have, because we've got with us Lynne O'Donnell. Lynne is a war reporter, war correspondent. She's covered many of the major conflicts across the globe over the last 2 decades. She covered the Iraqi war. She covered the Afghanistan conflict and was on, I think, Lynne, am I right, the last commercial flight out of Kabul last year? Is that correct?
Yes, as I understand, yeah.
So that's pretty special stuff.
Absolutely, and we've also had the afternoon with Lynne as well, with the Birmingham Press Club.
Yes, we this afternoon we've been, Lynne has been speaking at the Birmingham Press Club, and she's joined us for this podcast after that. There are 3 particular areas that we want to talk about in this podcast. We want to talk about education, we want to talk about business, we want to talk about the economy, we want to talk about, in particular, diversity, which I know is something that you're very, very keen on championing in SAF.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. We also want to get to know Lynne as a person, a little bit of background in terms of who you are, your makeup, some of your insights. And we again, in terms of the session today, particularly the Q&A is very interactive as well with the audience, and there's some fabulous questions that we got to listen to and hear.
Yeah, okay, Lynne. Let's start with the obvious question. What's a nice girl from Melbourne doing dodging bombs and bullets in some of the world's most dangerous places? How did it all happen? Was it a glorious accident or was it planned?
Oh, I think a bit of both, to be honest with you. I was a correspondent in China for newspapers and wire agencies, and I was on a train between Urumqi and Kashgar on the 8th of September 2001, and I was woken up on a train in the absolute middle of nowhere the following morning by the lady who worked for me as a translator and fixer and general right arm in Beijing, to say that the news from America she thought that I might be interested in hearing was that 30,000 people were dead in New York and the American president was missing. And the world changed. China had been the biggest news story in the world for a very long time throughout the rise of its economy. And I had ridden that wave professionally as a journalist, and then all of a sudden nobody cared where China was or what was happening there. And so if I wanted to stay at the top of my field and on the front page, I had to go where the story was, and that was to war. And that's what I did, and that's what I've done since then.
Absolutely. I mean, if I just go back to how you were telling that story at the session earlier on, you spoke about how freelancers are slightly different in terms of how they do things in comparison to the crews and the TV aspect of it. You're now a freelancer, but you've worked on both sides now, and as a freelancer, you said you got something about we need to have our wits about us. What's the makeup of, say, a freelancer? Because it's very much about entrepreneurialism, isn't it? It's about being out there, being in a position where it's about instinct and so forth. So, not everybody can sort of shift to becoming a freelancer. There's a slightly different skills, different trait. So just talk to us a little bit firstly about the differences, and secondly, in terms of how, if the world of journalism, how does it work in terms of individuals like yourselves going out there and doing things?
There is a huge difference.
Yes.
When I first started covering conflict and war in 2001 in Afghanistan. I was working for one of the biggest news organisations in the world, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. I was a correspondent in China for the Australian newspaper, which is his daily broadsheet flagship publication in Australia. But it also publishes The Times, The Sunday Times, Sky News, all of that. Enormous. But not very many people in Australia, Australian journalists at that time, had been war correspondents. I had worked for Reuters as well before. I worked for The Australian, and there is an imperative to work as a collective in big organisations. As a newspaper correspondent, and the only one in China, I was pretty much telling my editors what I wanted to do. As a freelancer, I can still make my own decisions, but if you look at what happens with television people, they move as crews, large groups of people, producers, camera people, as well as a correspondent and security advisors. Big television networks hire former soldiers who set themselves up as security professionals, who purport to be able to tell where is the most dangerous place at any moment of any day. And the organisations also have to have insurance for their correspondents and all the people they have in the ground. And the security and the insurance becomes symbiotic, if you like. And so there are some organisations I know where their insurance companies demand to know every few hours every day where the correspondent is, and they adjust premiums accordingly, depending on what the security assessment of that particular geographical location is. When I was working for the Associated Press, when I was bureau chief in Afghanistan, when I wanted to travel to do any work, whether it was to get on a helicopter with the American forces or if I wanted to go independently to somewhere to do a particular story, I had to do a security assessment and answer a whole lot of questions before my editors would tell me that it was okay to go, and then a whole lot of questions about how I would be equipped, who I was going with, who I would be talking to, where I would be. So very complicated. But when I went back to Afghanistan in 2021 to cover the final months of the war against the Taliban there, I went as a freelancer, and I was working with my friend and colleague Masood Hosseini, with whom I had worked at both AFP and AP when I was bureau chief at both of those organisations. And because we were freelancers, we weren't obliged to tell anybody where we were going before we went. So we could choose to go to a particular place, a particular front line, on the merits that we saw in the story that we wanted to cover. Very different. And really not so much more dangerous, even though we got into some scrapes, it might be said, not so much more dangerous because we were able to rely on our own wits and knowledge and contacts to go into dangerous situations and assess the levels of danger ourselves and get the stories that we wanted to do. And I much prefer working under those conditions, but maybe if I got blown up and lost a leg and didn't have insurance or a big organisation to have me airlifted off a nasty front line, I would feel very differently. But so far so good. Touch wood, I should find something to touch. Yeah.
When you go out to Afghanistan or to anywhere working as a freelancer, just talk me about, if you're obviously working for if you're an employee of somebody, then it's a bit different. Do you go out there and then try and find the stories and then try and sell the story in? Is that the way it works, or do you go out as a freelancer but you've been commissioned to cover a story?
Well, both. So last year, for instance, those last 3 months of the war in Afghanistan are a perfect example of how freelancing can work when it works well. I went out there with relationships with, for instance, with Foreign Policy magazine. I have a very close working relationship with them. If journalism was different, if news organisations still had loads of money, I would be on the staff of foreign policy. They treat me as if I am on staff. That's the relationship we have. But I'm not on staff.
Yeah.
But they took everything that I wrote, and then beyond that, I could write for other organisations. And as the story hotted up, Masood and I really brought the Afghanistan war story into the international arena, I believe, with the quality of the work that we were doing. Then suddenly we were in huge demand for radio and television appearances worldwide. And so that's how it worked. People came to us. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to make quite a lot of references to the talk that we've had. I mean, I've got 5-6 pages of notes here. So
you should be a journalist.
Yeah, I can't write in shorthand though. But there's a 5-6 pages here. You've got a quote here, which I want you to share with the listeners, which is, it says here, fear is a sign of intellect. Fear is nothing to be ashamed of. And we talk about bravery and so forth, and you talked about how you can be brave, but without actually, it's not bravado. It's about, it's again, you talk about wit, you've mentioned that, instinct, and it's also understanding, being emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent. So share with us in terms of situations where, you are scared, but you're still moving ahead, you're still walking ahead, and how does that work in terms of a psyche of a person? So I don't know whether you're able to add a little bit more there.
Yeah, it's not something that I think about a lot,
Yeah.
Because it does become instinctive and instinctual. But what I say is fear is a sign of intelligent life.
Yeah.
And I do think that if you're not scared in those dangerous situations, then you shouldn't be there, because fear is what pumps the adrenaline and keeps you aware and alert. We can't know or predict everything or anything, but we can be aware of the circumstances that we're in. That, for instance, if you're on a front line, don't stand by an armoured vehicle, because it's going to be a target for somebody with an RPG on the other side of that front line. And so awareness, knowing the sound of incoming versus the sound of outgoing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's that's learned behaviour as well as anything else. But yeah, I think that I think being afraid is what I said, is nothing to be ashamed of. Being afraid is what keeps you alive.
I mean, you spoke about leadership as well, and you said, there's strength in leadership. There's a lack of leadership, and and we commented on certain leaders and so forth, and there seems to be a void generally in leadership, in terms of politics and political figures. Why do you think that's the case? We're generalizing here, but why do you think that's the case in terms of our leaders, world leaders? Are they really true leaders?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think leadership and character are tested in certain circumstances. And if we're talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, for instance, he's facing a greater test than anybody should ever have to face. The guy was a television soap opera star, a comedian, and was derided when he was elected president. Oh, the Ukrainians, they've elected a comedian.
Yeah.
But look at him, he's leading his country. I do think that there is a lack of understanding of what leadership is and how people react to leadership, because they generally need leadership. And if you don't mind, I'll give you an example of something that happened to me. When I was the bureau chief in Afghanistan for Associated Press, I received a death threat by text message that was signed by ISIS. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, well, that's kind of funky. I'd never actually heard of ISIS sending death threats to anybody by text message.
Yeah.
They just kill people, they just do it.
Yeah.
it came after, and it made specific reference to a story that I had written about a mobile radio station that was on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and it was broadcasting into a particular area on the eastern border of Afghanistan to recruit people to the ISIS cause. They were paying more than the Taliban was paying to their gunmen, so why not, right? A couple of days later, the Americans bombed the radio station and killed about 5 people. And this text message I received made specific reference to that bombing and the deaths of the people in the radio truck. And I thought about it, and because I was the AP bureau chief, I was very high profile. AP is the biggest news organisation in the world, and really we were setting the agenda. We were, we did a very good job, and we were very high profile. And when I made it known to people in Kabul that I had received death threats, there was a lot of investigation. A lot of organisations wanted to get involved in finding out where they came from. But in the meantime, I told my bosses in New York about it, and they wanted to close the bureau down, and they wanted me to leave Afghanistan. And I said, I can't. I'm the bureau chief. It's my job to be the bureau chief no matter what the weather is, whether it's sunny or snowy. I have to be here, and people have to see that they have a leader in me, and that's my job. And so I refused to leave. And I think at the time, I like to think that it was very important to the people who were working for me and with me, who weren't just journalists who'd been covering war for, 15 years. They were cooks and cleaners and drivers. And if I left because I got a text message from, whoever it might have been that wanted to kill me for a story that I'd written, I'd be running away and leaving them there. And I thought that would show a real lack of commitment to my job, a lack of commitment to them, and also a bit of a middle finger up to them. I can leave. See ya. Yeah. Not good. No. Not good at all.
Okay.
And so when I see, and I was talking before about, Zelensky being a leader, he has stepped up and people are behind him. And, he went and visited wounded kiddies in a hospital a few days ago. That's real leadership. And there is an incredible hubris that goes with, we're living in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Look what we've got.
Yeah.
It's been pretty poor. There is no stepping up and taking responsibility and being accountable for mistakes or corruption or bad behaviour, or it's lacking.
Any other noteworthy or remarkable world leaders that you think that are at that sort of stage where you can say that's true leadership?
Well, I think Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand was the leader that New Zealand needed at that time, with during COVID, and she really showed true leadership and won the confidence of the majority, as far as I could tell, of people in New Zealand at a time when they really, we were all very vulnerable and suggestive and afraid for quite some time. And I think she stepped up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your own style of leadership? Because you've managed teams. You talked about team of 40, and you talked about teamwork and so forth. So how what's your how do you work with people, and has that changed? Has that evolved?
Well, I think it does evolve because nobody teaches you how to do that, especially in journalism. You're just thrown into it. Yeah. Okay, go be a bureau chief. Oh, my God. And suddenly you've got, when I was at AFP, it was 20 people working for me. Then AP, it was 40 people working for me. And when I say for me, I don't mean they were all taking orders, but not one word or photo or bit of video that left any of those bureaus did so without me having a hands-on role in it. And people came to me all the time for advice and to talk through things, and, you know, even if stuff was happening with families. So, you learn as you go, and you also learn the cultural sensitivities, not only of the country that you're living in, but also within the office that you're working in, because you're stepping into, as a foreigner and as an appointee, you're stepping into a dynamic, an organic situation that already exists. And so you can only look back and see, how did I do that? Why was that successful? And I think that what happened in both of those bureaus, in a very dangerous situation at a very dangerous time, was that I made sure, and I think this is fundamental, every single person in the bureau knew what everybody else was doing at all times. Not only so we weren't wasting time and effort duplicating tasks, but also so that everybody felt that they were invested in what everybody else was doing, and that's how you create a team. And so when we were successful, when we did break, you know, world-beating stories, when we saw our stuff on local television, that we also beat the locals at what they were doing, really important stories, we all felt that we had a stake in it. And I think that's really important. And, you know, most of the people in both of those bureaus remain my friends. And when I went back to Afghanistan last year, when I was no longer the boss and the formality had melted away, those people who had just been colleagues were true friends, and I was welcomed into their lives as a friend.
Lynne, when you were running the bureau, you said something really interesting. You know, you got quite a number of people who worked for you. But would they have been locals, or would they have been people from overseas? Because, I mean, how we were looking at the diversity issue. You know, how would would it not be very difficult for a woman to in effect be the boss of people in those countries that have a particular view of the role of women? I mean, were the people that worked for you Afghans, or were they
all Afghans and all Afghan men?
So how did that work?
It turned out that the death threat that I had received came from within the bureau. Because, you know, if you get 40 Afghan guys at random anywhere, in any room, let's say 10% are going to be a little bit on the extreme side. And so a couple of those guys didn't like the fact that I was a foreigner and I was the woman and I was the boss. But they wouldn't have liked the boss, whoever it was. And also I made the bureau work. You know, we were there to work, and a wire service works 24/7. And they didn't like that. So there was the personal and the professional, and any foreigner would have been, you know, the enemy stuff about it. And really that problem, that's their problem. But most people are people, you know, generally.
But would any of your team have been female, or was it an all-male team?
No, they were all men. I was the only woman and the only foreigner.
Were you able to pick your own team, Lynne?
No, I went into a pre-existing team.
Existing team. And,
Yeah. And I brought in some people to work casually, or when we needed extra staff, I did the hiring. But no, I walked into a pre-existing team.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, interesting. In terms of, say, you know, you've got an existing team, and you always have some bad eggs in a team, and some mindsets that don't work, and you've got a vision that you're setting out and so forth. You know, you talk about hiring people, but were you able to sort of fire at, or let people go, or this is a team that you've got and that's it?
No, that's one of the problems, I think, with working in a satellite of a big organisation, is that as a bureau chief,
you're stuck with
I didn't have the power to hire and fire.
Okay.
And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what it meant is that there was one particular bad egg who I just didn't
Yeah.
He slept at his desk every day, and
Yeah,
that was fine by me, because otherwise his stuff was poor quality, it wasn't accurate, he was a liability when he was awake. So that's how I dealt with that, because I had no choice. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go a little bit back to foreign policy. Well, not back to foreign, but we'll talk a little bit about foreign policy. And you mentioned again in the presentation about Biden as a president and his style of leadership and what he's doing, and you touched on Donald Trump before. United States has a big role in the world. Regardless of what your viewpoint is, it has an impact in every single aspect of it. Where do you think the United States role is currently in terms of the whole, just the Pakistan-India situation? Because I think they're trying to steer them a little bit away from Russia, and India is sort of still trading with Russia, and you've got Pakistan who's got a different perspective. And in my household, we have a few Pakistani TV channels that we look at. So, and the news that we listen to there is slightly different to the news that we hear on the BBC, particularly with regard to the current conflict and the situations going on. So there's a sort of the United States angle. There's also in terms of the dynamics between Pakistan and India, and your input, if I can. It's a fairly large topic there.
Yeah,
but
it's huge.
Yeah.
I spent all of February in Pakistan.
Okay.
And it's not a country that I feel very close to, or that I have a real depth of knowledge of. And my perspective on Pakistan was, for a long time through the prism of Afghanistan, where, as I mentioned, Pakistan is loathed. Was loathed, probably not by the Taliban now in control. Yeah. I thought that it was very important for me to go to Pakistan so that I could understand the perspective of global international relations, if you like, from the Pakistani perspective. What I found was that it comes in layers, that there is a very, very different viewpoint amongst the educated middle classes, if you like, to that of the hybrid civilian military government. And I believe that one thing I learned is that Pakistani people are very badly served by their government, by their so-called leaders. That it is probably a corrupt criminal cartel, if I can say that.
Is that still current, or is that
Currently, yeah. I think that the military is very assiduously and stealthily taking control of the institutions of civilian. Of civilian leader, of parliament, of the judiciary, certainly of journalism. I met journalists whose homes have been broken into while they've been in it by people who say that they're ISI, Secret Service agents, and beaten them up. People are being sacked, they're being threatened. The news is very heavily censored. Journalists are afraid to do their jobs. And I believe passionately in the role of journalism in holding power to account, and that light in Pakistan is going out very quickly. I see the military as taking over. They're on a land grabbing crusade. They're dealing with, or not dealing with, 2 civil wars. There is terrible marginalisation of some ethnic groups, and incredible poverty, and the bad management of the economy means that inflation is soaring and people are getting poorer. Middle class people are getting poorer every day, being driven into poverty. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
So,
how does it fit into the whole
where's
thing?
the United States relationship there in terms of the link?
Well,
there?
there is a leadership. Imran Khan is the Prime Minister at the moment, and the military have already said they'd like him to step down, probably because he's a bit incendiary. But he is very much on the back foot and very defensive when it comes to the Western, his country's relationship with the Western world. And I think that he is possibly heading for a historic judgment that he was on the wrong side of history. And because we are at a historical pivot. And if Pakistan doesn't get this right, then it will be on the wrong side of history, and I think that is to the detriment of Pakistani people. A friend of mine said, Pakistanis have all got Stockholm syndrome. The Pakistani passport is worth nothing. They can't go anywhere. They can't get out of their country, and yet they have such incredible potential. I just came away sad,
Just for the benefit of our listeners, because obviously one of the things with podcasts is they can be picked up at any time. They're very accessible. We're recording this particular podcast with Lynne in the early spring of 2022. So that gives our listeners a point of reference if they are, picking this up at some other time. It's a fascinating conversation that we're having, and we hope that, if you enjoying what we're doing, you'll like and hopefully share and subscribe. Lynne, I want to talk about something which you have mentioned, which is the impact of the current situation in early 2022 in the Ukraine, in terms of how that might bring a terrible situation with regard to famine and lack of food to a part of the world that you're very familiar with. Could you just talk us through that?
Yeah, the Republic of Afghanistan that was supported for 20 years by the international, i.e. Western Alliance, collapsed on the 15th of August 2021. And then, the Taliban took over, and they're a really revisionist, extremist, misogynist, criminal organisation. And suddenly the world focused on hunger in Afghanistan, even though there's always been hunger. Every year, United Nations organisations warn that we're heading into winter and kiddies will die of hunger. But the economy collapsed as well because the United States sanctioned economic activity and banned any dealings with banks there, for instance. And so that means that ordinary people's bank accounts are frozen. They can't put a card in an ATM and get their own cash out to buy food. And so the situation has really spiralled downwards. With no money going into the central bank, it means salaries for teachers aren't being paid. With no money going to NGOs, which had funded the health sector, health workers also not being paid. So it's a very difficult and nasty situation. But how does this relate to Ukraine? Well, the World Food Programme, for instance, buys about 70% of its grain from Ukraine and Russia. And we're in spring 2022, spring planting is not likely to happen in Ukraine. So there will be a much smaller crop. Russia has banned the export of a wide range of commodities in order to ease price pressures domestically, and that includes food, wheat, for instance, and fertiliser to the Central Asian states. Well, at all, but, there are countries in Central Asia that rely on Russian exports, especially of fertiliser, but also of grains and sugar. So already in countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, we're looking at shortages of sugar and fertiliser. And fruit and vegetables. Afghanistan relies on Central Asian countries for a lot of its supply of food, wheat, for instance, fruit and vegetables from Uzbekistan, as a for instance. Now, as shortages start to bite, and they will, in Central Asian nations, exports will also stop. And that means that food supply in Afghanistan will become even tighter and prices even higher. And so if we're looking at hunger now, hunger on the edge of starvation, we will probably see, in my own assessment, hunger tip into starvation and starvation tip into famine in the near future.
Okay. Very interesting, Lynne. We spoke. I mean, we spoke, but you spoke a little bit earlier on about fake news, or we talked about. I mean, I think quoting you, you said the first casualty of war is truth.
I'm sure that's not original, but,
but
I said it.
But you've said it today, and this world fake the word fake news has been in our vocabulary, I think now for a number of years, and you talked about obviously how you saw stories, or how journalists source their stories. So sometimes it's the rush to be the first breaking news, and there's another term here that I'm going to quote you, which I thought was fascinating: weak, woke West. So just to tell us a little about this, the rush to be the first, the rush to get the news out there. And now there's also another side to that, which is about slow news, actually understanding the news rather than breaking news. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in terms of this this rush to be the first, breaking news, that sort of market about. These stories are, how do we as individuals get our information? You again said there's so much information out there, but it's a lot of it is about filtering through the noise and filtering through and getting a source that you can sort of feel comfortable with, and that tells you a holistic view as opposed to maybe a one-sided view.
I think it's a very complex but important issue. Fake news was, it was what the person who called it fake news didn't like, right? Well, that's rubbish. That's fake news. And then everything became fake news. And then we all became fakers and enemies of the people and liars and, all following our own agendas, or an agenda of the agenda of the person, the company, the whatever that was paying us. I think that, it's taken news organisations, mainstream news organisations, far too long to learn how to monetise the digital space. So I heard somebody on an American podcast describe it as, imagine if you go into a coffee shop, let's say a Starbucks, every day, and you get your mega caramel flavoured latte frothy stuff in a big cup for free.
For free, yeah.
And then one day you go in there to pick up your free coffee and they say that'll be $5, please.
Yeah.
And you go, what?
Yeah.
I don't want that. I've never paid for it before. Why should I start paying for it now? And that's what happened with news.
We don't see the value in it.
Yeah. So what I do had no value at all.
Yeah.
And nobody understood out there that I'm a cost centre and that it's the advertising in the newspaper that pays for me to do what I do. Not only my salary, but insurance and, health cover and pension and taxis to get to stories and planes to get, all of that stuff. Nobody quite understood it. And even now, even though, there is a little bit more sophistication in the understanding of where information comes from and who gets it, because at least one thing that the fake news thing did was identify people as journalists, it's people who do that. It's people who are doing the so-called fake news. So there was a little bit of, a silver lining in it. But I still get, when I put stuff on Twitter, tweets back, I can't access this. It's behind a paywall. Can you put the whole thing out there. And I'm like, well, how do you think I get paid? If you don't pay for it, there's no money to pay me. Part of the complexity is also how the digital space has really been overtaken and taken advantage of by hostile players, if you like. And Russia has been very good at this, and China is also very good at. They have armies of bots, if you like, and people whose job it is to create bots and to create really fake, false news and put it out there, and also to attack people like me and to undermine me as a professional journalist and paint me as making it up. And I found this when I was last year doing stories on the Taliban, stories that really had an impact and were very important, were attacked for days and weeks on end, and I was undermined, and and Masood, even his photos were undermined by armies of Pakistan-based pro-Taliban trolls. So it's very, very dangerous. But people want ease; they want convenience because we're living in a convenient world. And so being able to get your news on a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed or YouTube channels, God, a cab driver in London the other day, he knew everything. There wasn't anything he didn't know because I watch, he said, alternative news.
Okay.
And I'm like, what's alternative news? He's like, YouTube channels. I'm like, oh my God.
Yes.
But information is out there if you have the wits and the time and the desire to source it, but to look at a story like Ukraine, for instance, from every angle. And there is so much out there that is on Ukraine that can be verified, that anybody with any brain should listen to a Kremlin spokesman saying, actually, it's the Ukrainians doing it all to themselves, and know that that's rubbish.
I think we lack sometimes the attention span, and we look for the headlines or what's easy, and we sort of tend to figure people into good and bad continuously, and I think that seems to be the cycle that we go through. We don't. Yeah. There's no learning from that. So,
and there's also a desire for sensationalism, for the wow. Yeah. Instead of the information.
Absolutely.
Just how can I educate myself about this particular topic that is important?
Absolutely.
I think another issue with the media world as it is now is the danger of sort of confirmation bias, because what you get is you've got algorithms that drive people to the places that almost create an echo chamber of their own particular views. So you don't get the opportunity to hear different points of views and different positions. One of the things that Saf is passionate about, Lynne, is education. I don't think he minds me saying that, he comes from a family that came from Pakistan to the UK when he was a youngster, didn't speak any English, and has gone on to be a successful businessman. So a huge passion for education. So I'd just like to, perhaps we could talk a little bit about two things that come together. One is education in countries like Afghanistan, and the second is diversity, because as I understand it, now the Taliban are back in charge. So much of the stuff that was happening in terms of getting girls into education has been put on hold or stopped. I know it's something which is hugely important and something SAF feels very strongly about. So just give us your take on education in Afghanistan and diversity and what's happening now.
Well, what's happening now is that education is a political bargaining chip. The Taliban are using the education of girls as leverage for international support, money, charity, diplomatic recognition. And they're getting away with it. Most girls have not been able to go to school for the more than 7 months since the Taliban took over. we were told by some of our civilian and military leaders ahead of the collapse of the Republic that the Taliban had changed. They were okay now. They were reasonable. We could do business with them. They're kind of modern. Anybody who knew anything and had been paying attention for 25 years knew that that wasn't the case. And certainly most Afghan people knew that that wasn't the case. And I mentioned when I was speaking before that just 3 American, US government agencies, department, State Department, Defense Department and USAID between 2002 and 2021 spent more than $700 million just on programs for women and girls. And so we can assume, and they said we know that this came out from the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction. Their job is to follow the money. And so they know that it's probably a lot more than that. Excuse me. It disappeared, it evaporated overnight, and education for girls has ceased. And so what you have now is boys being educated according to a curriculum where they are taught numeracy by counting bullets and reading by the recitation of jihadist slogans, and there is glorification of suicide bombers. That's part of the current Taliban credo. And the girls are being kept in ignorance because the Taliban regards them as lesser human beings. And this is creating a black hole in Afghanistan because it's if you don't educate women, you don't educate a family. But this is also bleeding into Pakistan, where Imran Khan is courting right-wing extremist religious groups. And, I was just there. I spoke to a lot of women's groups. It was ahead of International Women's Day. And I spoke to organisers of the events to mark International Women's Day. And they fear that gains for women in Pakistan are also under threat and receding to some extent because those who would attack those gains are being given a confidence by what's happening next door in Afghanistan. And Imran Khan himself says, education in Afghanistan, they never had education for their girls anyway, which is just like, that's just mind-blowing that he would get away with saying that. Now, diversity in Afghanistan, it's an issue. It's a country with ethnic groups, Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and other smaller groups. And the Taliban are effectively and essentially a Pashtun nationalist movement. And there were a lot of problems with diversity under the Republic, government of Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai. But now there's no accountability, so the Taliban are just getting on with excluding, to a great extent, abusing, disappearing, killing extrajudicially Hazaras and Tajiks. Yeah.
So if you've been in Pakistan fairly recently, haven't you? I mean, what's your reaction to what Lynne says? How does that fit with your observations?
So my family comes from Azad Kashmir, which is what we call Free Kashmir in Pakistan, and we're in an area called Mirpur, which is majority of the British Pakistanis they come from that area. And one of the topics continuously is the debate is news channels are on. Everybody thinks that we've got free sort of free press. Journalism is ripe, and everybody is continuously watching either Pakistani dramas, or sports, or it's going to be news. These are our top sort of 3 topics, and whether you go to somebody's house or on the streets, everybody's talking about politics. So it is continuous, and everybody thinks they're a journalist in their own right, and they've got, they can fix the world and so forth. So it is a hot topic. I think there's an element where, as you said earlier on, that relationship with Afghanistan it's predominantly been quite an aggressive type of relationship. Afghanistan feels that it's been used, and Pakistan feels that they should be closer with us rather than with India, as an example, and so forth. And it's very, very complicated. And I think, it's one of these dinner type conversations where you just can't, where you start or where you finish, it just doesn't get anywhere.
A lot of shouting in between, right? Yeah.
So I tend to sort of stay a little bit away from that and try and talk about other things, and particularly in terms of the positivity there's so much growth that's happening in some areas, but the difference between rich and poor is getting wider and wider, just like it is here. Yeah. And I think there is an economic issue there. There is definitely price rises. All of these concerns are there. But it's a very entrepreneurial, enterprising nation. There are a lot of startups. They're moving towards digital skills, trying to sell themselves to the world, and really, the average person, they're concerned about food on the table, roof over their heads, and progressing. That's what the average person is interested in. They're not really that interested in some of the bigger stuff. Yes, it's good to talk about it and know about it, but it doesn't help them on a day-to-day basis. And we've got to go back to that element of, if you can't, it's that, the hierarchy of needs, isn't it? We've got to get that shelter, the food, and so forth. And if you can't get that right, then what's the point of talking about some of the what we call the bigger stuff? Because that's predominantly for people who've got the basics. Yeah,
I mean, this is a special conversation, different format to normal. And the problem with having somebody like Lynne is we could be talking for ages.
Absolutely.
So perhaps we're coming perhaps towards the end of our time. But I think that, Lynne, I'd just like taking up on the points that the SAF just raised. From a business and an economic perspective, I mean, what is the economy of Afghanistan? I mean, is it all drugs? Is it, I gather there's some precious metals and that sort of thing. I mean, what sort of economic story is there, and how do you see that going forward?
Well, the economic story in Afghanistan is all about potential, and really it's all about unrealised potential. People, like to say Afghanistan sits on $1 trillion worth of mineral assets, but it's only worth $1 trillion if somebody gets it out and gets $1 trillion for it. Yeah. The Chinese government took ownership of a massive copper mine just not too far from Kabul, and has sat on it, promised the world, of course, and what their plan sounded like they were going to do, what the Chinese communists did after the revolution, was create a copper town. Like they did, Shenyang was all about making cars, and Baotou was all about mining coal, that sort of thing. Yeah. And it never happened. And the reason that it never happened is because China is the biggest user of copper in the world. And so as long as it sits on the second biggest high-quality copper deposit in the world, it controls supply and price. It's the same with everything. There's, Afghanistan has lithium, it has talc, it has marble, and gemstone, sapphires and emeralds and lapis lazuli and gold and coal. It's got, of course, it's even got oil and gas up north. But as long as it's in the ground, it's not worth anything to anybody. Yeah.
I mean, do you find that people from that part of the world, like SAFARAZ, who's quite entrepreneurial, very entrepreneurial in terms of attitude, or is that not possible to characterise people in that way? I mean, is it just a case that like any other country, there are those that are entrepreneur and those that are not. I guess what I'm saying in a very inarticulate way is, are we talking about a people that, if they have the opportunity, do want to get on and do things?
I think that people are people, and wherever you go and wherever they're from, culture and language they're ephemeral, right? And everybody wants, I believe, most people want their kids to be educated and to be happy and to be fed. They want a roof over their house. They want to know that they can, a roof over their head. They want to be able to walk out their front door in the morning and know that they'll come back safely at the end of the day. They'd like the buses to work and the telephone to work when they want to make a call. Everybody really wants the same thing deep down as human beings. And so, of course, in Afghanistan, there are entrepreneurial people, and there are people who aren't so entrepreneurial. Yeah. I worked with journalists in Afghanistan for a long time, and they have a passion for the news the same way I do. But I was also in China for a long time, and beneath the repression of media by the Chinese state, Chinese journalists wanted to be journalists the same way I'm a journalist. I just think that it doesn't matter where you go. People are the same. The variety is the same. The diversity is the same. The desires, the ability to love or hate or, walk down the road, it's all the same. And until we get to that point where everybody thinks that and believes that, we'll have problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've got the advantage, and we've got a few minutes.
Yeah.
Are there any particular issues that you'd like to just...
I think again, I'll make reference to the presentation, the question and answers session that we had earlier on, and you spoke about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and I think there's a sort of a phrase which basically talks about Falkland War and how more people have killed themselves. How many soldiers have killed themselves after the war and during the war due to the stresses of war. And the last few years we've all been talking about mental health and mental well-being and so forth. And and when you're going into these conflicting sort of difficult situations, there's this word again, resilience, has come in mind and so forth. So how, any sort of ways and techniques you say, and what's your sort of general take in terms of dealing with this very stressful, very sort of difficult situations, any sort of just general words and experience that you may have had with regard to mental health, mental well-being, and just stresses of difficult situations, because we all deal with different things, in our own way. So again, it's a very big topic there.
Yeah, it's huge. But you're talking about me personally.
Yeah, just general advice that you would give to somebody else, or your views on that matter, really.
Yeah. Well, I go from saying with one breath, people are people and we're all the same, to saying that, we do deal with these sort of stresses very differently, and we're affected differently.
Yeah.
I said earlier that I do. A lot of people ask me, why do you do this? And I do it because I can, and I do it well. And I have seen people who can't do it and shouldn't be doing it. And there is a necessity for a level of self-awareness, of knowing where your limits are and when you should stop and when you should get out of a situation and how to look after yourself. But to be honest with you, I don't know, like I said, I don't not sleep. I don't have sleepless nights. I don't have nightmares. I can see things in my head, like I described the two guys being beaten to death in front of us in Herat. Yeah, I can see that. But my biggest memory from that incident was standing Masood was over there taking photos of these guys being beaten to death, and I was about to move. I was standing there watching it and thinking, this is pretty heavy duty. And I was about to move, and I felt a hand on my right shoulder. And I wasn't gripped by somebody who wanted to stop me moving or control me. And it wasn't a tap. It was this very sort of, I can still feel it on my shoulder, and just sort of making me aware that they were there in a very sort of gentle but firm way. And a voice said, "You don't need to go over there." And so I stopped, and I didn't even look around to see who it was who'd put their hand on my shoulder. I just stopped. And I thought, he's right, I really don't need to go over there. So it's that sort of a memory rather than, there's a whole lot of crap that goes on that's in my head, but I just seem to get on with it. Maybe I'm a bit weird. Maybe people think I'm weird. I don't know. Yeah. I think I've become much more circumspect as I've got older, and much calmer, and also a little bit less irritable, with things. I'm quite willing to let things take their own course. I recognise that there are situations that I find myself in that I have no control over, and so I don't get stressed about them. But, I've seen people just fall apart and be complete messes without any self-awareness.
Wow.
Yeah. So I know that's not answering your question at all, but, I don't really know what else to say.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, again, you have I think, from a personal perspective, as you said, it is very much individual as well, and we can sort of categorize in situations, but it is about dealing with things in our own way and learning about ourselves. And we're not the same people that we were, say, 10 years ago, even a few years ago. So it's that continuous development, and really, it's been insightful listening to yourself. You definitely have a powerful story, and I've had the privilege of listening to the Q&As, and you've had a room full of 100+ journalists that I've had the privilege of that, and again your time today really very, very memorable, and thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it's been my privilege.
Yeah.
Really has.
I mean, absolutely, Lynne, and SAFARAZ, and I. Hugely grateful for you giving us this time, and I think our listeners will be as well, because this has been it's very special for me, because I'm a journalist, and for me, people like Lynne are heroes, and I know that there's a lot of stuff in what you said. We could go on forever, but we won't, and we can't. So it's now time to bring this Canny conversation to a close, to hope that our listeners have enjoyed it. If they have, then like, subscribe, share, and until the next time, stay safe. Bye-bye.